Good afternoon. I'm Laura Justice, the Executive Director of the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy, and I'm thrilled to welcome you today to the Crane Center's 9th Annual Symposium on Children. It is, sorry, I just got a note from the captioner. We're working to get the captioner on. That should happen in a second. It is so good to have you with us today. We are thrilled about today's fantastic lineup of speakers and anticipate having captivating discussions about policies, practices, and ideas that inspire action when it comes to investing in children and families. We'd also love to know who's here with us today. I see the numbers increasing on my screen. We're so thrilled at how many people are interested in our work and engaging with us. We'd love you to use the chat box and say hello and where you're from, perhaps. And throughout all of the sessions today, please feel free to stay connected and engaged using the chat and question and answer boxes. All housekeeping items will be shared in the chat as well. I'd like to share my screen for a minute and talk to you about the Crane Center for Early Childhood Education and Policy. Oops, my slides are not advancing. There we go. So go back to the beginning. A quick overview of the afternoon. We'll just spend a little bit of time welcoming you, and then we'll move to our keynote address, which I am very excited about. We'll have a brief break and then a breakout session of which you'll choose one, and I know it's going to be difficult. Then we'll have another break, and then we have a really exciting policy panel. And then I'll make just very brief final remarks about the day. So as I already mentioned, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Use that for any housekeeping. We have a Q&A box for questions, and we are recording this, and we always put these items up on the Crane Center website. Please fill out the survey after each session for Okra credit. I want you to know a little bit more about the Crane Center at Ohio State University in the College of Education and Human Ecology. We do state-of-the-art research focused on early childhood, and one of our primary goals is to influence policy. And also we do stay very engaged in practice and try to build bidirectional relations between research and then practice and policy. And for those of you who haven't visited us, we are co-located with the Schoenbaum Family Center about a mile east of the Ohio State main campus. And through our Schoenbaum Family Center, we provide direct services via our A. Sophie Rogers School for Early Learning on site, as well as a very large early Head Start program that transcends Franklin County. We have an amazing team of people working with the Crane Center. These are our 20 graduate research assistants who transcend a number of fields across our college. We also have absolutely terrific postdoc scholars and senior scientists, and you can see them here. We also have a large number of faculty affiliates who bring expertise to our work from across the campus, and that's what makes our work so much stronger. We get to engage with nursing, sociology, engineering, and communications, and more. I also wanted to highlight our 9 joint faculty. These are faculty associates who have part of their formal appointment to the Crane Center, and their work is just out of this world. Arya Ansari, Matthew Brock, Ji-Young Choi just joined us here at Ohio State, and we are thrilled. Scott Graves, Becky Huang also just joined us from Texas. We're thrilled. Lauren Jones, who you'll hear from today. Oops, I skipped. Soo-Jung Lin, Shane Pasta, and Kelly Pertel. And these are our core faculty who engage in the centers while also maintaining a strong role in their departments. And I depict this to show that our work in the center involves faculty in each department in the college and just strengthens the work that we do. Just to give you a snapshot of the type of work we do federally funded research projects like PI Piasta's Promoting Preschool's Early Language Learning. We produce peer-reviewed research article like Dr. Graves' examination of interventions for racial inclusion and equity. And we also produce quite often briefs that are meant to provide digestible looks at what we do, such as this recent brief called Big Little Leap, which focused on kindergarten transaction. Some of our recent contributions to the field, one of our teachers at the Schoenbaum Family Center wrote an article in Developmentally Appropriate Practice focused on emergent literacy skills. Early Head Start coaches recently presented at the National Head Start Conference focused on conversations around anti-bias and anti-racist practices in early education. That's been a focus of a lot of our work the last several years, well, for many years, but much more intensively last several years. And we're really excited about the state's investment in one of our core interventions. It's a curriculum supplement called Read It Again, designed to promote intentional teaching of early literacy skills in infant, toddler, and preschool classrooms. And we are being supported by the state to scale Read It Again across all early childhood programs across the state. We're incredibly excited about having the opportunity to develop relations with all the providers across the state of Ohio. Another recent activity that Lauren Jones actually led is working with major state entities focused on subsidies for childcare programs and working with them to analyze Ohio's child subsidy program and ideally improve it so that more families can access subsidies and allow their children to participate in early learning. So we're very excited about all this work and continuing to grow our portfolio of research, policy, and practice work. Please visit our website and join us to receive e-news and weekly policy digests. These are great resources that we curate to keep you informed. Thank you for joining us, our 9th symposium. This year, we're focused on why and how we invest in children. We have a terrific keynote and panels, as I mentioned. And again, I just want to thank you for engaging with us today and being with us all afternoon. I would now like to invite Dean Pope Davis, the Dean of the College of Education and Human Ecology, to welcome you with a few remarks. Dean?
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for the introduction, and I welcome you all as well. I'm glad to be here and to look forward to the great lineup of experts and advocates for this year's Symposia on Children. The College of Education and Human Ecology is the training ground for those working to improve the human experience. We take seriously our charge to invest in every student, and we're pushing the boundaries to solve problems with bold purpose and informal resolve. And we do it by valuing a diversity of ideas and perspectives, from visionaries hailing from big cities and small towns, from first-generation students and second career dreamers, from people of all faiths and traditions, colors and genders and cultures. Our strength is in our differences, and it shows how we'll be a force for change in the world today. Together, we invest in making lives better, particularly those of children. These investments are grounded in our 5 core values: excellence, justice, diversity, innovation, and internationalization. So, what does all of this actually look like? We prepare the educators of tomorrow by equipping our students with the knowledge, skills, and convictions to teach learners from all backgrounds and to lead advances in the practice of education and educational research. The College of Education and Human Ecology creates education leaders at the forefront of developing sound educational policy, and we advance human experiences that shape social behavior and improve health, wellness, and consumer experiences. And of course, through our colleges centers like the Crane Center for Early Childhood Research and Policy, along with their partners at the Schoenbaum Family Center. Together, they serve families, educators, scientists, and advocates by conducting innovative research and translated it to inform better practices and policies around the field. They are engaged in translational research, which is important in this area in particular. They are uniquely situated at the intersection of research, practice, and policy, and are dedicated to improving the well-being of children at home, in school, and in our respective communities. I am proud to support this work as the Dean of the College of Education and Human Ecology here at Ohio State. I'm also thrilled to be here today with you for this very important discussion, and I am now pleased to introduce you to Tanny Crane, President and CEO of the Crane Group and a longtime supporter of the Crane Center. As a well-respected leader in the business community, Tanny is a steadfast advocate for early childhood care and education. Our visionary leadership challenges us all to consider how to do more and to do better for every child and every family. We are very grateful for her ongoing partnership to advance this work. Thank you. Tanny?
Thank you, Dean Pope Davis, and to Laura and your team at the Crane Center for organizing today's event and bringing us together to discuss this critical topic. As with so many parts of our care economy, the pandemic laid bare how very broken our early care and education systems were even before 2020. This sector is struggling. I don't really need to tell any of you that. In fact, I'd say the reason early care and education is surviving is because of the dedication and grit each of you are showing in the face of such challenges. You are essential to our community and to the economy, and the work you do is the embodiment of the word investment. And I know that many of you are doing this work while facing incredible personal challenges. A recent study in one state showed staggeringly that 1 in 5 childcare directors and 1 in 4 childcare staff are not able to pay their bills each month. In addition, the infrastructure of early care and education is crumbling, creating even more hardship. Action for Children recently reported that just here in Central Ohio, 245 childcare programs have closed, more than 1 in 6 since the beginning of the pandemic. For the programs that remain open, many cannot staff their centers fully and must look at raising tuition. Parents are already paying extraordinary amounts. Waitlists are long, and families, oftentimes mothers, are forced to leave their workplace. This impacts a family's personal economy and our collective economy at large. It is all broken, and fixing it requires us to acknowledge what was broken long before this and to rethink how we invest. That's why we are here. Every year, this symposium brings together leading experts on critical topics in early care and education. And there is not a topic more critical right now than investing in and stabilizing this sector. It is also critical to examine this topic from multiple angles, which is why today we are going to talk about investments that start early, cover a broad array of supports, because we know that a child's education isn't just about their child care center, but it's about whether the family has stable housing and access to nutritious food. And of course, investments that continue beyond the early years. A one-time investment can't be expected to cure all of society's ills. We must commit to continuing to support the healthy development and quality education for the long haul. This is an issue that impacts us all, from parents preparing to bring home their first child, to elementary teachers who are noticing that so many children come to school lacking the skills necessary to succeed. to the health of our business communities. We must invest for the benefit of every child. Yes, but also for our families, workforce, economy, future leaders, and for each of you providing their care. Thank you for taking the time today to commit to discussing solutions and to inspiring one another, even amid these great challenges. Today, you will hear from a fantastic lineup of speakers and look at research on investments, funding alternatives, and communities who have innovated in this realm. It is going to be an inspiring day, and I'm excited to be here to learn alongside you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanny and Dean Pope Davis. Very inspiring remarks. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our keynote speaker, Dr. Karabo Jackson. Dr. Jackson is the Abraham Harris Professor of Education and Social Policy at Northwestern University. He is also a fellow at the Institute for Policy Research, a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and co-editor of the American Economic Journal on Economic Policy. Dr. Jackson, he's a labor economist, and his research spans labor economics, public finance, and applied econometrics with a focus on the economics of education. He looks at topics such as the role of teachers in the K-12 system and how public school spending affects students. His research, which I believe is what he's sharing with us today, on the real benefits of investing in schools is bar none best in class for this type of work. So I'm thrilled to hear from him today. His research has been featured in outlets such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. And it's so exciting that Dr. Jackson is willing to share his knowledge and background with us here at Ohio State today. So let me just welcome you to the stage, Dr. Jackson, and we're all so excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Justice, for that introduction. Let me just get my slides up and share my screen. So thank you all for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So the title of this talk is Measuring Success. And I want to sort of frame the conversation with two quotes that I think encapsulate two views of education in the United States and generally speaking. So there is a view that I think is pretty common right now, which is the contemporary view that education is really about reading, writing, numeracy, and content knowledge. And the quote is that a good teacher, so the quote comes from a discussion of teacher quality, a good teacher is one who is best able to get learners to master the content of the school subject. And I think from this perspective, what we really care about when we think of education is whether people understand the basic facts and information that is included in the lesson plan. But I think if you look back from a historical perspective, the way that we think about education has been a lot more broad than this. So here's another quote. So a good teacher is one who thinks properly in terms of the preparation of young people for life, preparation of young people to perform well in the situations which they will face as citizens, as workers, as members of homes, in their leisure life, and in their attainment of physical and mental health. So I think this broader view of why we have schools and why we have education is one that applies most accurately to how we think about things and how we should think about things. And I'm going to show you some evidence from research documenting that schools and the education system actually can have a much broader effect on student outcomes rather than just test scores. And then sort of think about what the implications may be of this for how we think about how we evaluate successful intervention, how we think about how we should sort of structure the system in general. So I want to start by talking about the Head Start Impact Study. So in 2002, about 5,000 newly entering eligible 3- and 4-year-olds were randomly assigned to be in a Head Start program. So these individuals were either randomly assigned to be in a Head Start group that had access to a Head Start program and services, or they were randomly assigned to a control group that did not have access to Head Start, but they could enroll in other early childhood programs or non-Head Start services selected by their parents. So this is actually a really, really important study, in part because it was a randomized control study. So one of the things that we care about a lot as social scientists is when we observe differences across populations, some of whom may have participated in an early childhood program, and some of whom did not, we worry that some of the differences we observe are due to unobserved factors that we've just not taken into account. So one of the ways you can deal with this is by using some sort of randomized design where you know exactly why one child ended up in one situation and another child ended up in another. We know it has nothing to do with the fact that perhaps the parents of some children who were more motivated were the ones who were able to get their kids to enroll in Head Start or something of that nature. So the randomized controlled trial lends itself to very credible inferences about what the real causal effect of enrolling in this program is. So this is a really powerful design for making statements that can be really helpful for policy. It was representative of children across the nation and also representative of the kinds of programs that Head Start typically runs. So what they found in this study was that there were some large initial benefits as measured by sort of cognitive tests and also socio-emotional measures, but then they found that the effects tended to fade over time. So while they saw some benefits while they were in the pre-K program, by the time they entered 2nd and 3rd grade, the test score differences between those that were randomly assigned to the Head Start program and those that were not basically went away. Now, some people have looked at this and said, well, does that mean that there's no real benefit to the Head Start program? So there are a few important caveats I'll just sort of mention that will highlight some of the topics I'll talk about later on in the breakout session. But the first is that about 16% of the children in the control group, that would be people who were not supposed to be in Head Start, actually did enroll in Head Start within the first year of the study. The second is that about 15% of children who were assigned to the treatment group, that would be people who were supposed to enroll in Head Start, actually did not end up enrolling in Head Start. And the third is that about 60% of the control group parents enrolled their children in some other kind of preschool program in the first year. So what that means is when we're making comparisons between those that were randomly assigned to the program versus not, we're not necessarily comparing Head Start to non-Head Start. We're comparing some mix of Head Start and non-Head Start. And we're also potentially comparing Head Start to some other kind of sort of preschool program, which may be better in terms of quality or worse in terms of quality. And it's important to take that into account. So it's really important to keep track of what the comparison group is, because I think this is really important for interpreting whether the effects of these programs tells us something about the relative benefits of rolling out pre-K programs versus not. So there are two studies that do exactly this, Klein Walters and Feller et al. And to summarize what they find, essentially what they find is that if you compare individuals who enrolled in Head Start, who are switching from some sort of home-based care, so individuals who otherwise would have been in home-based care, there were actually pretty considerable gains in test scores. But if you compare the individuals who were randomly assigned to Head Start to who would have otherwise gone to another pre-K program, there are basically no effects, or there are potentially even some negative effects. So I think this sort of underscores two things. It underscores first that, when we think about the benefits to pre-K, we have to think a lot about quality. We have to think a lot about whether the program is providing a holistic set of inputs, providing wraparound services for the kids, so that when we think about where we're going to find effects, it has to be the case that the program we're evaluating is of higher quality than the one that we're comparing it to. And second, it's also really, really important to keep track of what the comparison group is. Are we comparing Head Start to other pre-K programs, or are we comparing Head Start to what would be happening in the home? And it turns out whether you're using one comparison versus another, your outcomes are going to be very different, and the interpretation of that result is going to matter tremendously on what we're looking at. So that's the first thing to take into account. So the second thing I would say is, in these studies, even though they take into account the comparison group, what they did find was that the test score effects did seem to fade as well. So even though they found that if you were to compare Head Start to being at home, the test score gains were much larger than the initial study suggested, they did find that even in those cases, by 3rd or 4th grade, the test score effects were relatively small and not statistically significantly different. So they couldn't detect any differences across the groups. So I would say that one interpretation of that is that maybe these programs don't matter, but I think that's the wrong interpretation. So I'm going to basically spend a lot of time talking about the fact that test scores don't measure everything. So it's entirely possible that we have these test score effects that fade, but there are meaningful benefits to the program that we have not really taken into account. So, much of the education literature in general, not just the early education space, but also the K through 12 space, has really focused on test score measures of school quality. And this is largely out of necessity and data availability, not because people are sort of making bad decisions necessarily. Oftentimes, we collect test score data as a matter of course of what we do. We have legislation that requires tests to be administered. So this is often something we can look at. It's concrete, it's tangible, and we estimate effects on test scores. But I'm going to sort of highlight in my recent work, basically much of this in the K through 12 space. With collaborators, I'm going to sort of basically document that, school effects on test scores are actually, they're relatively weakly related to meaningful effects on important long-run outcomes. I'm going to be talking about outcomes such as crime, teen pregnancy, and labor market outcomes. I'll show you evidence from a variety of different national contexts, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, and also in the United States. And I'll also look at evidence looking at teachers, documenting that teacher impacts on socio-emotional learning, which are measured by sort of psychometric surveys, surveys that talk about what students' underlying skills and also behaviors, such as attendance and disciplinary outcomes. Those effects are actually relatively weakly related to teacher effects on test scores. So the teachers who are improving test scores are not necessarily the ones who are improving these behaviors. And it turns out that the teacher effects on these behaviors are more predictive of their long-run impacts on students. And then I'll sort of circle back and discuss some of the implications of this work for how we think about the success of early childhood programs, how we think about how we should evaluate it, and also how we should think about the kinds of programmatic decisions we should make when designing these pre-K programs. So the first paper I'll talk about uses data from Barbados. And it's basically it's looking at the effects on students of enrolling in a selective school. So in a variety of different national contexts, there are schools that are very highly sought after. They're deemed to be the best schools in the neighborhood, and everyone wants to get their kids into these schools. Now, there's certain settings where people have to either apply to these schools and they get admitted by lottery, or they apply to these schools and they get admitted based on a standardized test. The nice thing about these designs is if we use the lottery, we can identify the causal effect of going to these schools because it's determined by randomized lottery. We know that the reason one kid got in and one didn't get in has nothing to do with family background. It's because one kid got lucky and one kid did not. There are also other designs called regression discontinuity designs, which I'm going to talk about, which use the fact that when you apply to these schools, there's typically a test score threshold above which one is admitted and below which one is not. But across a variety of different settings, generally speaking, we find that there doesn't seem to be much effect. So across a variety of different settings in the United States, in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, in South America, we tend to find in general that there's very little average effect of attending one of these really sought after schools. So I think this sort of leaves the question, are parents just misguided? Are they choosing these schools because they don't understand how the world works? Or do they potentially value the school's impacts on other dimensions other than those that are well measured by standardized tests? So for this study, we're going to use data from Barbados, and I'll just talk you through this very briefly. So Barbados is a relatively small nation in the Caribbean, and we have test score data that are measured at the end of 5th grade for a number of years. And then we basically have follow-up survey data that are measured on these individuals in 2015. So we have information on individuals when they were in 5th grade as children in 1993 to 2016, and then we have survey data measured in 2015. So we have data, longitudinal data, that tracks individuals who are working in 2015 to when they were sort of applying to secondary schools multiple years before. In Barbados, students take an exam and submit a set of choices of the schools they want to go to, and they send it to the Ministry of Education, which is a centralized place, and they are assigned to schools administratively. I'll talk a little bit about that. So they're assigned to schools in a way such that all applicants to a school essentially are admitted to that school if they score above the admission cutoff score for that school, and they're not admitted otherwise. So you can just sort of think of all the students who apply to a school. There's a certain set number of slots, and there's basically a threshold test score. And if you score above that test score, you're admitted. And if you score below that, you're not. This actually allows for a very nice, credible way to identify the effect of going to a better school without having to worry about family background. The idea is that if the test score cutoff is 50 points, A kid who scores 50 is basically the same as a kid who scores 49, but they are exposed to very different environments. So we're going to use this idea to estimate the effect of going to one of these selective schools on student outcomes. So the first thing I'll show you is just a graph, and it's showing you what happens to the likelihood of attending one's preferred school. So this goes from 0 to 1. 0 means you don't attend that school. On the y-axis, 1 means you attend the school. And you can basically see, we've basically lined up the outcomes relative to 0. So people who are at 0 scored exactly at the admission cutoff. People who scored below 0 scored below the admission cutoff. And people who scored above 0 scored above the admission cutoff. So essentially the way to read this graph is on the left-hand side of 0, those are people who would not have been granted admission. On the right, those would be people who would have been granted admission. And what you basically see is as one's test score goes through the admissions cutoff, one is much more likely to attend a preferred school. And we see a sudden jump, a discontinuous jump in the likelihood of attending one school. So if we think that the likelihood of attending a preferred school matters for outcomes, we should also see a similar discontinuous jump in outcomes as well. So this is another graph basically showing you the same plot, where instead of showing you the likelihood of attending one preferred school, we're now showing you whether one passed one secondary school examinations a few years later. As you can see, there's no effect. We see no effect of attending these really highly sought after schools that are deemed to be excellent schools on examination performance. However, when we look at whether the individuals were likely to earn an associate's degree, when you go through 0, you see a little space, which is telling you we see a discontinuous jump in likelihood of earning one of these associate's degrees. And then the last thing is we look at a long-term index, which is sort of an average that measures things like labor market earnings, whether people are employed, measures of health, whether they have access to medical care. And we see a pretty large jump on this long-term index, despite the fact that we saw nothing in the test scores. So this is a case where we have a scenario where we have a pretty credible design that identifies causal effects. We see no effects on test scores, but we see large meaningful effects on things we care about. So the school is not improving test scores, but is getting kids to subsequently have positive labor market earnings. They're employed, they're earning more money, they're employed in better, higher paying jobs. They have better access to healthcare, they're in better health. We also find some reductions in also teen motherhood as well. So there are a host of really important outcomes that we're measuring impacts on, and they're not being detected by test scores. This is going to be a common theme that you're going to see. So you may sort of ask the question, well, how related are school effects across these outcomes? So in another study, what we basically do is we use data from Trinidad and Tobago. So it has a very similar setup to Barbados. Students are assigned to secondary school after 5th grade using a very similar approach. And then we link a whole bunch of different administrative data sets to the admissions data for secondary schools. So we link it to basically records on police records, administrative employment records, birth records, all sorts of things. So look at the effects of enrolling in a school on a variety of outcomes. And then what we're going to do is we're going to basically estimate the effects of attending a school on a variety of outcomes. Some of them are going to be test score outcomes, and some of them are going to be non-test score outcomes. And then we're just going to see the extent to which schools that raise test scores tend to improve these other outcomes and vice versa. So we have outcomes. Our high stakes examinations is our test score outcome. We also have some low stakes examinations. We have whether individuals drop out from secondary school. We look at teen births and look at teen arrests. And then we look at whether individuals are formally employed in the labor market. So the first thing is we find that schools have pretty meaningful effects on these outcomes. So in general, going from a school that's sort of at the average versus one that's sort of at the 85th percentile. So basically an average school to a school that's pretty good in the top, say, 20% of the distribution of quality, they're reducing dropout by about 9 percentage points, which is a pretty large effect. They're reducing the likelihood that someone is arrested by about 3.7 percentage points, which again is a pretty sizable effect. They're reducing teen births by 17.3 percentage points, and they're increasing employment by about 7 percentage points. So these are large, meaningful effects, economically meaningful effects on outcomes that we think matter. And it turns out the effects of schools on test scores are largely unrelated to these things. So test scores seem to be missing a lot of important information. So what I've showed you so far suggests that, well, okay, fine, we care about long-run effects, and test scores are not necessarily identifying it. So how do we do that? From a policy perspective, if we want to identify those interventions, be them schools or teachers or preschool programs or pre-K programs, we want to identify the ones that are likely to have success later on. How do we do that? So I argue that basically there's a lot of research out there suggesting that sort of what some people call non-cognitive skills or soft skills or socio-emotional skills that are not captured by standardized tests. We're thinking of things like adaptability, self-restraint, motivation. These are key determinants of adult outcomes, and they're not necessarily particularly well measured by standardized tests. So that's one way one place to sort of look. And I'm going to talk about a few research papers that follow this road. So the literature basically provides a reason to suspect that interventions may affect these skills that go undetected by test scores, but they may nonetheless be important for students' long-run success. So the first study I'll talk about looks at the effect of individual teachers on student outcomes. I'm looking at basically high school teachers in this context. So I lay out a framework, and I'll just talk through what the framework says. So the first is that teacher effects are going to be correlated for outcomes that reflect similar skills, which is to say that a teacher that raises test scores in math in 9th grade is likely to also have effects on, say, SAT scores in math. But another implication is that teachers could have effects on test scores and have no effect on certain long-run outcomes. It's entirely possible because students have different skills. They have cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills, or soft skills and hard skills, or socio-emotional skills. It's entirely possible that you could have a teacher that has positive effects on test scores, but has no effect on crime, because maybe the crime component is really largely determined by soft skills. So a lot of basically different implications. You could have groups of teachers could have similar effects on long-run outcomes, but only some of them may have impacts on test scores. Again, this is because long-run outcomes maybe reflect a combination of skills, both the sort of the test score skills and the socio-emotional skills. They all matter for the long-run outcomes, and we're only potentially measuring one. The other one is that sort of impacts on test scores in the short run may be able to identify teachers who improve things in the long run. But I would argue that if you look at teacher effects on non-test score impacts, or look at teacher effects on, say, behaviors, on socio-emotional learning, these sorts of things, you're potentially going to be able to identify excellent teachers in ways that test scores would not identify. I'm going to argue that that may explain some of the things that we're going to see that we saw earlier in terms of these programs, the Head Start program in particular, not having positive effects on outcomes as measured by test scores. So I'll just briefly talk about the logic of value added, and then I'll talk about the measures. So essentially, the logic of value added is that you don't want to simply, so we're trying to identify the effect of an individual teacher or a school on outcomes. So you don't simply want to compare the outcomes across teachers in this case, because you'll be potentially penalizing teachers who serve less well-prepared students to those who teach more well-prepared students. And potentially this would be inaccurate about the contribution. The students are not randomly assigned. Some teachers may get the students who are predisposed to having high test scores, others not. And just comparing test scores across teachers is not a particularly meaningful measure of teacher quality. But if you have enough data on test scores and behaviors and a whole bunch of information about the student over time, in principle, you can use that information to get a good predictor of how well a student is likely to perform in a given year. So the basic idea is as follows. So let's say we have some data in year one. This is sort of the pre-year. We have the student's test score at the beginning of the year or at the end of last year. And you have a whole bunch of information about the student. It could be their ethnicity, their gender, their family income background, all sorts of these rich sets of information where they have an IEP. And using that information, you can create what is essentially like a doppelganger, someone who looks just like that student. And you can figure out in the data what the likely outcome at the end of the year would be for students who look just like that individual student. And that's going to give you sort of a prediction of where that student is likely to be at the end of the year. Now, we actually have data on the student, so you can look at how well the student actually performs at the end of the year. And the difference between those two things we can consider value. So it's a measure of how well a student performs relative to what you would have expected based on their benchmark, where their benchmark incorporates a lot of information about historical performance, demographics, and all sorts of family background. Now, if one student overperforms expectations, you might say, well, maybe that was just a student who worked very hard this year. But if all the students in a teacher's classroom or all the students in a school happen to overperform their benchmark, that tells you there's something happening in the classroom that is improving outcomes. And that's sort of the logic of value adding. And we're going to do this. I'm going to use this approach to identify the effect of teachers on both test scores and also on a set of behaviors. So I'm going to use microdata from North Carolina and estimate 9th grade teachers' value added on test scores, and then what I call a behavior index. And basically it's a mix of attendance, their GPA, and I use GPA here as a non-test score measure because grades are a function not just of how well one does in exams, but also the extent to which you show up to class, you raise your hand, you participate, you're willing to hand in extra work for extra credit, those sorts of things. Those are all things that feed into having a higher GPA, even if your test scores are low, for example. I look at things like grade repetition and suspensions, and also basically a measure of disciplinary outcomes as well. So I create an index of these behaviors and ask the question, how much are teachers moving the needle on test scores or behaviors, and are they related to each other? So the raw correlation between these two measures is actually pretty low. So the key take home from here is essentially that if you look at, say, the bottom third of teachers, and that's on the figure that you see here on the left, if you look at the bottom third of teachers in terms of how they perform in behaviors, this covers the entire distribution of test scores. So basically what we're saying is, among the worst teachers at improving behaviors, you have some excellent teachers at raising test scores and some bad teachers at raising test scores. The relationships are relatively weak. In other words, knowing whether a teacher is very, very good at raising test scores tells you little about the extent to which that teacher is going to improve behaviors and vice versa. Now, it turns out these things are largely unrelated, but if you just let the two things try to, as in a horse race, to see which one better predicts how well students perform later on in life, it turns out that the behaviors value added has a lot more predictive power than test score value added. So the behaviors, the extent to which teachers are promoting positive behaviors that are manifested in showing up to class on time, showing up to class regularly, handing in extra homework, working hard in classroom for classroom participation, not acting out in classroom, all those things, teachers who are promoting those kinds of behaviors have a much larger predictive effect on the likelihood that someone graduates from high school, the likelihood that they take the SAT, and the likelihood that they attend college than a teacher's effects on test scores. So again, sort of making the same point here that effects on test scores measure something important, but they may miss a lot of important things. And I think what they miss is particularly important for thinking about what's happening in the early education space. So what about other soft skills and other outcomes? So another paper that I look at, so this is using data from Chicago. We look at the effect of attending high schools. And instead of using behaviors, we use these sort of soft skills measures. These are psychometric measures developed by psychologists to measure things like how well adjusted people feel and the extent to which they are motivated to work hard. So we're going to explore if survey-based measures capture skills that are useful for predicting long-run outcomes that are not measured by test scores. So again, we're going to estimate school impacts using the same value-added methodology on these skills in 9th grade, using data from Chicago Public Schools. So we have information on college going, we have information on arrests, and we have all these self-reported measures of socio-emotional skills. So I'll just talk a little bit about them. So these are the measures of sort of what we call hard work, are things like grit, which measures the extent to which people work hard towards their goals, study habits, the extent to which people take time out of their day to check their homework when they're handing things in, and also academic engagement, the extent to which people say, I like working hard, I see a connection between my schoolwork and success in life. That's what we combine all these measures to talk about promoting hard work. So these are sort of soft skills that matter quite a bit. The other set of soft skills we measure, we lump in what we call social well-being. Those are basically a combination of things that measure the extent to which people feel safe at school and the extent to which they feel as though they're included in their schooling environment and that they like their classmates. So to summarize what we find is if you were trying to predict high school graduation, if you use only test scores, these are the blue bars here, having a teacher that is sort of at the average versus one who's in, say, the top 20% would increase high school graduation by about 1%, 1 percentage point. If you did the same thing for teachers who improve surveys, it's about 1.6 percentage points. So looking at high school graduation, we can basically identify a larger impact of teachers using their effect on surveys than their effect on test scores. You see the same thing for four-year college going. Using the teacher effect on test scores, one at the average versus one at the top, say 20%, increases college going at four-year colleges by about 2.3 percentage points, 2.3 percentage points. Doing the same analysis for teachers who improve the survey measures of socio-emotional learning, we're talking about 3.4 percentage points. So it's a pretty big difference. So the surveys are doing a much better job of identifying those settings or schools in this case that are improving long-run outcomes that we care about. We see the same thing for school-based arrests. Again, test scores do predict effects on reduced criminality. But we see similar things for the surveys as well, and the surveys do a better job. So there are a few other patterns that are worth mentioning. One is that we find that the socio-emotional measures actually predict achievement gains for several years, but not vice versa, suggesting that socio-emotional learning, these socio-emotional skills like these are actually foundational. So teachers who raise test scores, that does not predict their socio-emotional measures later on, but teachers who raise the socio-emotional measures, schools who raise the socio-emotional measures do also improve test scores contemporaneously and also later on, suggesting that these socio-emotional measures are foundational for success. The other thing that we find is that the students at the lower end of the sort of distribution in terms of academic preparedness and academic sort of advantage are the most responsive to improvements in these socio-emotional measures. So the schools who are the least advantaged, coming from homes that are sort of lower income, exactly the kinds of populations you think are going to benefit a lot from PK programs, are the ones for whom these soft skills, schools that raise these soft skills, are particularly beneficial. So what about long-run effects of early childhood interventions? So I'm going back to the early childhood programs. So I would say that research using K through 12 data shows that test score measures may only be pretty unreliable measures of program quality. And I would say even so, there's sort of limited evidence that programs that have lasting effects on achievement as measured by standardized tests. So what are the long-run effects of childhood programs? Again, and we have some evidence on this. So one of the studies I'm going to talk about is my own, looking at the effects of Head Start spending. So in this case, we're going to examine the long-run effect of Head Start using county-level rollout of Head Start between 1965 and 1980. So during that time, Head Start was sort of, the first program was established in 1965, and it was sort of rolled out across different counties over time. So we're going to use something called a difference in difference approach. Basically, what this means is we're going to compare cohorts that would have been 4 years old when a Head Start Center was established in their community. Those would be the group that was treated. And then we're going to look at the outcomes of cohorts that would have been, say, 5, 6, or 7 years old, and those would have been untreated because they're too old to have been influenced by the Head Start program because they're already in elementary school. So we're going to compare the outcomes for treated 4 and below versus untreated, I guess 4, 5 and older, before and after the establishment of a Head Start Center in the community. And that's how we're going to hopefully remove some of the potential confounding that we worry about if you're comparing people who choose to enroll in Head Start versus not. We're really comparing people who enroll because the Head Start Center was available compared to those who didn't enroll because the Head Start Center was not available. So here's just a graph that sort of illustrates our approach. If you look on the far left, we basically see we're basically lining up outcomes for individual cohorts based on their age when a Head Start Center was rolled out. So year 0 would be individuals who were essentially 3 years old when a Head Start Center rolled out. -2 on the y-axis would be individuals who were essentially 1 year old. Sorry, who were essentially older, who have been like 5 years old when the Head Start Center rolled out. -4 would be individuals who are 7 years old. So everything to the left of 0 are going to be cohorts who are too old to be impacted by Head Start because their Head Start serves 3 and 4 year olds. And then everyone who's to the right of 0 would be individuals who were 4 years old or younger at the establishment of a Head Start Center in their community. So we're just comparing exposed cohorts to unexposed cohorts in these communities before versus after a Head Start was established. So as you can see here, basically, I'll point you to the middle panel. In the middle panel, we're looking at the educational attainments for these same cohorts. In the middle panel, we're looking at communities where the Head Start rollout was very, very small. And then on the far right, we're looking at communities where the Head Start rollout was very, very large. The amount of money that was spent on Head Start was much larger. And basically what you see is the series in the middle sort of bounces around a lot, which is telling you that when the Head Start rollout was sort of small amounts of money and it didn't change very much, outcomes don't change very much between those who were 4 and younger compared to those who were older. However, in those communities that saw large sustained increases in Head Start spending over time, we see a pretty clear, compelling pattern that those individuals who were young enough to be impacted by the Head Start rollout, those cohorts had much higher levels of educational attainment years later than those cohorts from the same exact communities who would have been 5, 6, and 7 years old at the time of Head Start rollout. So using this sort of approach, we basically identify the effect of Head Start, and we find that basically access to Head Start increases the high school graduation rate amongst low-income kids by about 10 percentage points. It increases the years of education by about 0.3 years, almost a third of a year. It increases wages by about 9%, almost a 10% increase in wages due to having access to a Head Start center. And the likelihood of being ever incarcerated basically falls by about 2.5 percentage points. I'll just mention that the effect on wages is actually large enough to pay for itself, in a sense that we're going to have increased collection of taxes later on for the 40 years that these individuals work. That means that the program essentially pays for itself in basically the increased collection of taxes and the reduced dependency on social services. So now I'll just sort of circle back to another randomized trial that sort of documents some long-term effects and sort of relates this to the test score impact. So my work basically shows that test scores miss a lot of information, and my work on Head Start basically shows that, well, Head Start absolutely did have large impacts on the long-run outcomes, but you may say, well, okay, well, is it the case that the Head Start programs that you evaluated, these 1965 programs, maybe those had effects on test scores and we're not really comparing the same thing? So I think this last study I'm going to talk about is really important for getting at this issue. So this is a recent study that looked at the effects of Boston Public Schools' universal preschool program. So this uses, again, another randomized research design to examine the long-term outcomes of children who attended a large-scale program. The nice thing about this is that they look at both long-run outcomes and short-run outcomes on the same sets of kids, which allows us to really make some statements about the extent to which we're really missing out on important long-run outcomes by focusing only on test scores. One of the nice things about this, it's a pretty large intervention. It's covered about 4,000 preschool individuals, and it was also for a relatively recent period. So the data they collected were between 1997 and 2003. So we're talking about a much more recent situation, which I think is more policy relevant for what's happening today compared to the rollout of Head Start, which happened in 1965. So you have much more recent cohorts than the older Head Start data, and we have a randomized design. So what they basically find is summarized in this figure. They basically see that the likelihood of graduating high school is larger among those that were randomly assigned to enroll in the Boston preschool program compared to those who were not. The increase is about 6 percentage points. Not quite similar to the effects that we found for Head Start. They find effects on college, basically attending college on time, of about 8.3 percentage points. They find the likelihood of going to college increases by about 5.4 percentage points. All of these effects are statistically significant, and all of them are economically significant. So we're seeing an increase in college going rate going from about 65% to 70%, which is a pretty big effect. So the key thing here is when they looked at the data to see whether you could have identified these positive effects using their test score data, what they found was that you could not. So they found increases in high school graduation, increases in SAT taking, increases in enrolling in college on time, increases in ever enrolling in college, but they found no effect on standardized tests at any point in time. They found no effects on the likelihood that an individual repeated a grade. Where they did find some evidence was that they did find some evidence of reduced suspensions in high school and also reductions in juvenile incarceration, suggesting that some of these behaviors that I think a lot of these well-designed preschool, early childhood education programs are trying to sort of deal with, these sort of soft skills, that the manifestations of low levels of these skills, such as acting out in school, those things did actually improve, or they didn't see anything in test scores. So my takeaway from this is the test scores are measuring something, but for the evaluation of most educational interventions, and I think preschool intervention in particular, I think test scores are going to be an unreliable measure of quality. So to conclude, early childhood programs tend to improve outcomes in the very short term, but it does seem as though there's some evidence that their effects on test scores do fade over time. But the evidence out there also suggests that these programs do tend to improve longer run outcomes. So my research is not the only research finding this. There are a few additional studies that looked at both the same rollout period and also more recent interventions, also finding that these early childhood programs tend to improve outcomes in the long run, irrespective of their effect on test scores. And early childhood programs' effects on long run outcomes are just not well measured by their test score effects. I think that's something that is really, really important to keep in mind. And I think it's really important to keep in mind because I think a lot of the conversations that we've had about the efficacy of early childhood interventions have been based on test score effects. So a lot of the conversation that people have had about the fade out of early childhood interventions is based entirely on using test scores as a measure of success. And I would argue that perhaps we should take a step back and think, well, if test scores aren't really the thing we want to measure, then maybe we should sort of think about these conversations in light of a broader, more holistic view of what we're measuring. But I think the implication here goes beyond the question of sort of what we're measuring in terms of measuring quality. I think it also has some implications about how we should structure early childhood programs themselves. So it suggests that early childhood programs should not be focused too much on academics. They should not focus solely on making sure kids can read, write, and do some math. They should also be focusing on educating the whole child. Some of these programs probably need to have wraparound services. So I know that Head Start, for example, has a lot of additional ancillary services in addition to a curriculum that does emphasize literacy and numeracy skills. They have training for parents. They make sure that there's nutritional standards. They serve high quality meals. So there are a lot of things that early childhood programs should be doing to improve outcomes for kids that are just not things that are necessarily have to do with numeracy and literacy skills. So I think the evidence out there suggests that we should take a broad view of measuring success, and we should also take a relatively broad view of how we create success. In my virtual panel, I'll talk a little bit about the role of funding for this, but I will conclude here and open it up to comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jackson. Just quickly to introduce myself, I'm
Did I lose?
Hi, this is Kathy. It looks like she froze. I'm gonna just bring Dr. Justice back on and she can help get the questions to you, Dr. Jackson. Hang on just a moment.
Hello, have I showed up?
Yes.
Well, I am happy to serve on the Q&A. Sorry about the technical glitch. Just as an FYI, it looks like Lauren might be coming back, so maybe we can tag team this. Oh, Lauren, you came back. How about if
I got booted.
Can I start with a question?
Go for it, please.
So I'm just curious from your opinion, Dr. Jackson, that was fascinating. Why are we so stuck on using test scores as the main evidence for program effect? So, and I'll duck out now and turn it over to you.
Should I answer that right away?
Yes, please.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Thanks for that question. So, I mean, I think there are many, many reasons. So I think one of them is that one view, I think, is that there's sort of a theoretically, the way I would describe it is people think of ability as being one thing. So you're either high ability or low ability. And I think that's one view of the world. I think it's an incorrect view of the world. I think we have different abilities, we have different capacities. But if you have that sort of one ability view of the world, then most people would say, well, okay, then you're just either high ability or low ability. Then all I need to, if I can raise your test scores, that's already telling me that you have all the skills you need to be productive in society. So from that perspective, I just measure test scores. That's a pretty good measure. That single number is a good measure of that single dimension of skill, that single dimension of ability, which sort of ignores, I think, the variety of skills and competencies that people actually have that they use in different settings. But if you have this sort of one-dimensional view, and there are many people who do, they think like, say, like IQ, they think IQ just explains everything. If you have that view, then there's no reason to move beyond test scores because all the other stuff is sort of not that important. So I think that's one reason. I think another reason is that, you know, in some sense, it's people think of it as being pretty concrete. Like if you take a test and you do well on a test, then you did well on that test. There's no question about that. And people think that's a good measure of what students know. When it comes to these sort of other measures, I think there's a question of whether they're actually measuring anything meaningful. So, you know, one of the things I think is helpful is one of the values I think of some of the work that I've done and also other people have been doing is just sort of validating this work, showing that yes, like if you take a test scores in 3rd grade or in kindergarten, and you sort of see whether that predicts outcomes later on, does it predict stuff? So there's a long history of people documenting that. The idea that we can do the same thing for these softer measures, I shouldn't call them soft, they're really important, but these other non-test score measures is a lot less well developed. There's, people are starting to do that. Now there is some work showing that, like, if you measure these skills early on in life, they are predictive of things later on in life. But I think that tradition is a relatively new thing in this world. And I think the other thing I'd add to that is I think, there's a lot more consensus about what test scores measure, about what we should be measuring in terms of test scores. I think there's a lot less consensus about what we should be measuring in terms of childhood environments and what success would look like. So I think some of it is just a question of we haven't yet gotten to the point where we know exactly what we should be measuring. So there's just a little bit of lack of consensus. I think the validation work is not necessarily as much as it could be, but I think we're heading in that direction to be sort of optimistic about things.
Thank you, Dr. Jackson. I'll just ask a follow-up question from Jamie O'Leary in the chat, who's asking about, if you have any thoughts on how we can better message this result that you're consistently finding in the literature, that the test scores are not the be all and end all. She says that some policy leaders often seem to think that the fade out means it's not worth it. So do you have any recommendations for how those of us in the advocacy community can kind of get this message across?
That's a great question. Yeah, no, exactly right. So I think, one is, the last study that I highlighted, I think to me was a really, really important one for addressing this point, because they did find long run effects on outcomes, despite the fact that they found nothing on test scores. I've been beating this drum in the K through 12 space for a while. This paper is like fresh hot off the press. So when I saw it, I was like, oh, amazing. This is making my point in the sort of early childhood space as well. And I think, so I think that's the first thing, is getting the word out that the long run effects are real. And it's not just real in terms of the old studies, it's real in terms of the recent studies as well. So I think that's the first thing that has to happen. I'm not sure that's happened yet. I think the research on this is still relatively new. But yeah, I think another thing which is important that I think is helpful to sort of think about is, oftentimes I think the messaging, the question was a little bit about messaging. I think oftentimes the messaging is unhelpful in a sense that people sometimes look at this and say, oh, well, now we should just stop test scores at all because they don't measure anything. And that's not my view. I think test scores are valuable. I think they measure something, but they don't measure everything. And I think we would be better served by having a message that sort of had that sort of, I guess, more realistic tone, which is, well, maybe we could do better at predicting things. Maybe we could do better at identifying successful programs if we use this additional information on these measures that we're not really using right now. I think that's going to be a much more fruitful path towards getting buy-in versus, oh, we shouldn't use test scores because behaviors are better. People hear that and they think, oh, this sounds like some soft stuff, and so I think some of it is messaging. I think it could be better.
Thank you. There's lots of questions in the chat, but I'm going to sneak one of my own in there, just take my moderator's prerogative. I'm wondering, I think when we think of a teacher, it's in some ways easier to think of the skills a teacher would need to impart to improve test scores. What do we know about the skills and behaviors that teachers need to have in the classroom in order to get these effects on the non-cognitive skills?
So that's a great question. And I would say probably among the people who are giving talks later on, I'm probably the least well qualified to answer it. But I think I would say two things. I'd say one, it's not clear, even in terms of teachers who raise test scores. I think there's a lot of question about what is the best way to do that. Even for the test scores measure, I think there's a lot of questions, and there's even more for figuring out what teachers should be doing in the classroom to improve these socio-emotional measures. So, I think there's a lot of exciting work that is happening right now. Some of it happening in Crane. So just seeing what's happening in the classroom. What are the practices that are going on? I think there are measurement tools that exist. I don't think they're designed for measuring the things I'm describing, but they do have some that capture some elements of this. But I think this is exactly an exciting place to be in the field, to sort of figure out what is happening in the classroom that we can identify and validate with these socio-emotional measures to see what's happening. But I think that's the work that I think is happening. And I think that needs to happen to be able to answer that question.
Yeah, it seems like just as it's difficult to measure and come to consensus about how to measure these non-cognitive skills in the kids, it's also probably the same issue to some extent and for the teachers. Okay, next question in the chat from Sunny Munn is kind of digging into one of your outcome measures. One of the earlier studies you discussed, one of the outcomes was no live birth by age 19. Sunny's asking, why didn't you use no pregnancy by age 19? Two very different outcomes, both with big impacts on individuals.
Yeah, so that's a good question. I mean, the short answer is the data that we have, we only know if someone gave using official records. So if someone had a pregnancy and it never was brought to term, that's not something we would measure. So if ideally, I totally agree with the spirit of the question, which is that yes, if we ideally we would have those information, because I think that's clearly quite disruptive to children's outcomes, but it's not something we had access to. So that's the short answer.
Thanks. Another really interesting question, which I'm not sure might be outside of your area of expertise, but I find it interesting, so I'm going to ask you anyway from an anonymous participant. Could these early childhood programs be used to combat child labor practices in developing countries like India? Would they have the same long-term positive impacts?
That's a great question. So, I've not worked in those settings, but I'm familiar with some of the research on this. And, my sense is my sense is yes, to some extent. So there are, there are two reasons why children are working. One of them is that the families need money. And the other is that in some settings, the returns, the economic returns, long-term, the benefits to going to school are sometimes kind of low. So if you don't have access to a high quality school, what's the point of showing up? Like there are some settings in particular villages where the teacher shows up literally half the time. So if the teacher's not there half the time, the student, from that student's perspective, why should I be going to school every day if half the time my teacher's not even there? So to some extent, there's a relationship between those two things. And I think having high quality pre-K certainly sets the kids up to benefit a lot from the schooling system. But then if the schooling system they're going to is not really promoting that or building on that, then it's probably going to go nowhere. So I think it's absolutely going to be an important stepping stone to getting there, but it by itself, it would not do it. So I think reducing those practices is going to require investing in early childhood education and also building up what's happening in the sort of primary school and secondary school cases, in addition to sort of possibly also providing some supports for families to reduce the incentives for the kids to have to leave the home. To leave school to take tend to the family. So I think all those things have to happen in concert.
Great, thanks. Rebecca in the chat is asking, I think, a question that is super relevant and also a huge one. We've been seeing a ton coming out about the impacts of COVID on test scores. Can you kind of contextualize your findings in the pandemic?
So this is, it's a great question. It's also one of my least favorite questions to answer because I really don't have a good answer for you. So, just as I've been saying before, I think test scores miss a lot. And, the NAEP scores, the 2022 NAEP scores just came out and they didn't look great. And people are like, oh my goodness, we've lost 10 years of gains in test scores. I think we've lost potentially way more than that in terms of other things. So my sense is that there are a lot of things that we're not currently measuring. I mean, to be clear, people are measuring things, but I think there are a lot of things that we are not measuring at the moment, measures of child well-being. So first, there's a well-being issue, but also there's a sort of the socio-emotional learning issue. So some students have basically gone 2 years without having any of the sort of learning from being around their peers. A lot of that has sort of taken a hit. Whether that's going to sort of just bounce back naturally, I just don't know. It could. It is obviously an unprecedented situation. I guess we had the flu in the 1914s, but I have not studied that. So I guess the short answer is I don't know, but I would say that the reason, my view informed by the research on what test scores can miss and how these other things matter a lot, certainly gives me a little bit of pause about focusing a lot of attention on the learning loss components of these things. I think we should do that, absolutely. But I think we do have to spend a lot of time thinking about some of the other things that are potentially have been negatively impacted by COVID. I think we're going to have more social workers at schools. We're going to have to be monitoring what's happening. Wraparound services are going to be needed in order to sort of get the kids that have been sort of affected in a deleterious way out of this thing.
Thank you. That's great. I'm going to sneak another one of my questions in. Just curious if you have any thoughts about the extent to which this maybe over-reliance on test scores to evaluate quality schools contributes to racial and economic segregation in our schools.
It is a good question. I suspect it might to some extent. You know, if you focus only on test scores, you might be sort of really want to enroll one's kids in schools that have high test scores to the exclusion of schools that don't have high test scores. And obviously, on average, test scores tend to be lower among communities that are less advantaged, have lower levels of income, et cetera, which tends to coincide across with race and ethnicity as well. So I think it definitely feeds into that to some extent. I don't think that explains all of the segregation that we observe. I think there are other reasons for that, but I think it does feed into it to some extent.
Thanks. Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left, so I think I'm going to probably conclude with this question from Rachel, which I think is a good one. Rachel's asking, what advice do you have for new early childhood education researchers who want to contribute to social justice for infants, toddlers, and preschoolers?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, I would say that, taking a broad view about what success looks like, I think is the first thing I would think about. Really paying attention to the differences between the people who come in across different categories, different ethnic groups, different income levels, thinking about what the needs might be specific to the community. So some kids may be coming in with different language being spoken in the home. I know that's something that we've known about for a while, but they're coming in with different backgrounds, coming in maybe with also sort of a trauma-informed perspective. In low-income communities, they're more likely to be exposed to things in the home that would have deleterious effects on the kids. That's going to play itself out in the school setting as well. Sorry, also in the preschool setting as well. So I think having a broad view about what programming should look like, and also having a broad view about what to measure and how we might measure things that could move the needle, I think is something that I would say. I don't have specific examples of what exactly to measure, but I guess my takeaway is it shouldn't be test scores. And I know a lot of people in the room probably already knew that, but that would be my takeaway. Sort of take a pretty broad view of what things are and think holistically about educating the whole child.
Thank you. And actually, I lied. We have 1 more minute. I'm going to finish with this other great question from Eileen. Referring back to your finding that essentially the long-term income gains from Head Start mean the program pays for itself in the long term. I think this complements other recent work in public economics showing from Nathaniel Hendren and others who essentially showing that most of the investments we make in kids in early education pay for themselves over the long term. Eileen's asking, how do we substantially show this for policy leaders? You mentioned earlier, for those of us who were there earlier today, the difficulty with the kind of like time mismatch of, yes, we're investing the money now, but we have to wait to see the benefits in terms of tax revenues. Do you have any suggestions for how to kind of illustrate this point to policymakers?
It's a good question. So yeah, so that work basically measures exactly that kind of, and sort of thinks about interventions from that perspective, which is, think about the dollar spent today relative to the gains that it generates for society over the long term. You have to sort of think about money in the future and account for the fact that you're getting the gains 20, 30 years, 40 years down the line. So I think the first is sort of even just thinking about when we talk about these interventions, measuring these things, making sure we're making that point pretty crystal clear. I think that's one thing. But I think fundamentally there is as you said, there's a temporal mismatch between when you pay the cost. You pay the cost today, you get the gains in 30 years. It's sometimes difficult to get people to pay attention to that, especially if they're maybe term limited out by the time the outcomes are sort of the increases are observed. So I think the incentives are not always necessarily aligned towards that.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, being with us. I'm a big fan of your work, so I'm really excited to have gotten the chance to hear you talk about it, and for you to kind of share your expertise with the Crane community and the larger childcare community here in Ohio. So we give you a virtual round of applause. And just to kind of fill everyone in on where we're going next, we have a 15-minute break. We'll reconvene in breakout rooms. So we've got 4 breakout sessions going on. Dr. Jackson is leading one of those breakout sessions. So if you want to hear more from him about school financing and kind of ways we fund education, then definitely attend that one. I'm also doing a breakout room. So we look forward to seeing everybody in those rooms. And again, you can all kind of give the applause thing in your in the chat or whatever. And thank you again to Dr. Jackson.
And thank you so much too.